anything I don't know. I'm going to tell you everything that I do know.
But since you learned it from others,
that's exactly right.
You could be wrong, right,
why I'm
Taylor?
here.
But since you learned it from others, you could be wrong, correct?
I am telling you what I heard them tell me.
And they could be wrong, or they could be mistaken, or they could have heard it incorrectly. Right, Ambassador Taylor?
People make mistakes.
Right, so you could be wrong. I yield the rest of my time to
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding. Ambassador Taylor, the gentleman asked if you could be wrong. Were you wrong when you said you had a clear understanding that President Zelensky had to commit to an investigation of Biden's before the aid got released, and the aid got released and he didn't commit to an investigation? Maybe not. I think the aid might happen, and it's my hunch it's going to get released. You use clear language, clear understanding, and commitment, and those two things didn't happen, so you had to be wrong.
Mr. Jordan, the other thing that went on when that assistance was on hold is we shook the confidence of a close partner in our reliability. And that's
not what this proceeding is about, Ambassador Taylor.
The gentleman has expired. Ambassador
That's
Taylor,
not what this whole thing started on.
The time of the gentleman has expired. Ambassador Taylor, did you want to finish your answer?
No, that's good, Mr. Chairman.
I now recognize Mr. Carson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I yield to the chairman.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Just want to follow up on some of the earlier questions about President Zelensky's statements after this scandal came to light, when he was asked, were you pressured, how'd the phone call go, et cetera. Ukrainians, Mr. Kent, are pretty sophisticated about U.S. politics, are they not?
Perhaps.
You would agree that if President Zelensky contradicted President Trump and said, of course I felt pressured. They were holding up $400 million in military assistance. We have people dying every day. If he were to contradict President Trump directly, they would be sophisticated enough to know they may pay a very heavy price with this president, were they not?
That's a fair assessment.
And President Zelensky not only had to worry about retribution from Donald Trump should he contradict Donald Trump publicly, he also has to worry about how he's perceived domestically, doesn't he, Ambassador Taylor?
President Zelensky is very sensitive to the views of Ukrainian people, who indeed are very attentive to Ukrainian U.S. politics, yes.
And so if President Zelensky were to say, I had to capitulate and agree to these investigations, I was ready to go on CNN until the aid got restored, that would obviously be hurtful to him back home, would it not?
He cannot afford to be seen to be deferring to any foreign leader. He is very confident in his own abilities, and he knows that the Ukrainian people expect him to be clear and defend Ukrainian interests.
Mr. Carson.
Thank you, Chairman. My colleague touched briefly on the campaign to remove career diplomat Ambassador Yovanovitch. Mr. Kent, you stated in previous testimony that you were aware of the, quote, campaign of slander against the ambassador in real time, which basically unfolded in the media. Where do you understand this misinformation campaign was coming from, and who was essentially perpetuating it?
To my understanding, the then Prosecutor General of Ukraine, now ex, Yuri Lutsenko, met Rudy Giuliani in New York on a private visit in January. They had a second meeting in February, and through the good offices of the former mayor of New York, Yuri Lutsenko gave an interview to John Solomon, then of The Hill, in early March, and the campaign was launched on March 20th.
A corrupt Ukrainian prosecutor gave an interview to a reporter in the United States and made claims that the ambassador provided officials with a, quote, do not prosecute list. Sir, do you have any reason to believe this is true?
I have every reason to believe it is not true.
What was the reputation of the man who made these allegations, sir?
Yuri Lutsenko was a politician of long standing. He had been Minister of Interior after the Orange Revolution. The U.S. Embassy had good relations with him for years. He was imprisoned by President Yanukovych, came out, was elected majority leader of Poroshenko, the then president's party, and then became Prosecutor General in the spring of 2016.
What was your experience with Ambassador Yovanovitch? Was she working hard to combat corruption in Ukraine, sir?
She was dedicated, as is every U.S. government official in Ukraine, to help Ukrainians overcome the legacy of corruption, which they actually have made a number of important steps since 2014.
So in fact, before all of this happened, you and your superiors at the State Department asked the ambassador to extend her time in the Ukraine, correct, sir?
That is correct.
Did you support her extension?
I asked her to extend until the end of this year to get through the election cycle in Ukraine, and then Undersecretary Hale in March asked her to stay until 2020.
Now, some in Ukraine probably disliked her efforts to help Ukraine root out corruption. Is that correct?
As I mentioned in my testimony, you can't promote principled anti-corruption action without pissing off corrupt people.
Fair enough. Now, some of those people helped Giuliani smear her, did they not?
They did.
So ultimately, that smear campaign pushed President Trump to remove her, correct, sir?
I cannot judge that. What I can say is that Rudy Giuliani's smear campaign was ubiquitous in the spring of 2019 on Fox News and on the internet and Twitter sphere.
So Ambassador Taylor and Mr. Kent, in all of your combined decades at the State Department, have you ever before seen an instance where an ambassador was forced out by the president following a smear campaign of misinformation orchestrated by the president's allies?
I have not.
Nor I.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Dr. Wenstrup.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Taylor, this should be easy because I'm going to use a lot of your words from the previous deposition as we go forward. In your deposition, you spoke of support for Ukraine and its relationship to the United States and how much you support that. In 2014, you, and I'm quoting this, urged Obama administration to provide lethal defensive weapons in order to deter further Russian aggression. Did the Obama administration provide lethal weapons?
No, sir.
They provided MREs and blankets and things like that. In your deposition, you also said President Obama's objection was because it might provoke the Russians. And in fact, you testified in your deposition that the Obama administration didn't have a good argument since Russia had already provoked and they have invaded Ukraine. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
It's a shame he didn't take the advice of a combat veteran like you, sir. Someone who understands what deterrence provides, because a lot of Ukrainian lives could have been saved if he had taken your advice. In your deposition, you said, and I quote, you were happy with Trump administration's assistance, and it provided both lethal and financial aid, did it not?
It did, sir.
And you also stated that it was a substantial improvement. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
So now we're providing javelins, which kill Russian tanks. MREs and blankets do not do that. Today you said, I was beginning to fear that the long-standing U.S. policy of strong support for Ukraine was shifting. I have a little trouble with long-standing based on what we just talked about, because it wasn't really long-standing strong support. It seems to me the strong support came with this administration. Would you agree with that, sir? Unless you consider MREs and blankets strong support, I wouldn't call it long-standing.
The long-standing that I'm referring to there, Dr. Winstrup, is the long-standing political support, economic support, and increasing military support.
Well, certainly that strong support came from Congress, but it didn't come from the previous administration as compared to what this administration has decided to do. The strong support came with this administration, not the Obama administration. And maybe now we understand what President Obama meant when he told Russian President Medvedev that he'd have more flexibility after his election. Maybe that flexibility was to deny lethal aid to the Ukraine, allowing Russia to march right in and kill Ukrainians. Again, in your deposition, you urged the Obama administration officials to provide lethal defensive weapons to Ukraine in order to deter further Russian aggression. And now they have that under this administration, don't they, Mr. Ambassador?
They have the javelins, yes, sir.
Thank you. And I would like to yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Ratcliffe.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. So, no pressure, no demands, no conditions, nothing corrupt, nothing on the call. That's what we heard President Zelensky say. And because House Democrats' charges against President Trump have been publicly, repeatedly, consistently been denied by President Zelensky, you heard the defense now from Chairman Schiff. He's lying because he has to. He has to lie because the threats, the demands, the blackmail, the extortion that House Democrats are alleging, if he didn't do that, he couldn't possibly risk military aid. He would have to do anything he had to secure it. The problem with that, the hole in that argument is you have to ask yourself, what did President Zelensky actually do to get the aid? The answer is nothing. He did nothing. He didn't open any investigations. He didn't call Attorney General Bill Barr. He didn't do any of the things that House Democrats say that he was being forced and coerced and threatened to do. He didn't do anything because he didn't have to. I yield back.
Ms. Spear, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for your true heroic efforts, both today and also throughout your careers. I'd like to start with you, Mr. Kent. In your testimony, you said that you had, in mid-August, it became clear to me that Giuliani's efforts to gin up politically motivated investigations were now infecting U.S. engagement with Ukraine, leveraging President Zelensky's desire for a White House meeting. Mr. Kent, did you actually write a memo documenting your concerns that there was an effort underway to pressure Ukraine to open an investigation to benefit President Trump?
Yes, ma'am. I wrote a memo to the file on August 16th.
But we don't have access to that memo, do we?
I submitted it to the State Department subject to the September 27th subpoena.
And we have not received one piece of paper from the State Department relative to this investigation. Both of you have made compelling cases of the importance of Ukraine to Europe, to the 70 years of peace, the benefit that it has to the United States national security, and our goal to continue to support sovereignty of nations. Meanwhile, Russia is violently attacking people in Ukraine in the Donbass area. So withholding military aid, does that weaken Ukraine?
Well, I think it sends the wrong signal, and it did for a short period of time. Again, the assistance from the FY19 was released and is in the process of heading towards Ukraine.
Does it embolden Russia when there was no aid being sent to Ukraine?
I think the signal that there's controversy and question about the U.S. support of Ukraine sends the signal to Vladimir Putin that he can leverage that as he seeks to negotiate with not only Ukraine but other countries.
Thank you. Ambassador Taylor, I think you mentioned that a White House meeting for Zelensky would boost his ability to negotiate for a peaceful settlement with Vladimir Putin and Russia in general. Is that true?
Ms. Spear, it is certainly true that U.S. support for Mr. Zelensky, President Zelensky, in his negotiations with Russians is very important and will enable him to get a better agreement with that support from the United States, both from the military assistance, but also just from the political assistance that we can provide.
But he has not yet had that White House meeting, has he?
He has not.
I think it's ironic that Soviet-born Lev Parnas, who has now been indicted, had a meeting with the president in the White House after participating in a number of campaign events for the president and contributing $325,000 to the president's PAC. So maybe it's actually the requirement that you give money to the president's PAC in order to get that meeting at the White House. Ambassador Taylor, is it true that the prosecutor general now has opened an investigation in Ukraine?
Mr. Spear, the new prosecutor general that President Zelensky has appointed is indeed investigating crimes in general. Is that your question?
Yes. But
Yes,
is
he is in office and is investigating criminal activity.
has he specified what investigations he's undertaken?
No.
He has not. All right. I yield the rest of my time to Chairman Schiff.
Just a quick question. My colleagues, a couple of my colleagues referenced the conversation, the hot mic conversation between President Obama and President Medvedev. That was in 2012. There's a suggestion that he was saying he was going to go easy on Russia over the invasion of Ukraine, but that invasion took place 2 years after that conversation. You don't have any reason to believe that President Obama was referring to going easy on Russia for an invasion that hadn't happened yet, do you?
Mr. Chairman, I have no knowledge of what was in.
It was more or less a rhetorical question. I will yield now to Mr. Stewart, or I'm sorry, Mr. Stewart.
Yep. Thank you. To the witnesses, thank you. Time is precious, so I'm going to go very, very quickly. Welcome, I think, to year 4 of the ongoing impeachment of President Trump. I'm sorry that you have been dragged into this. I think the sign behind me says it very well. By the whistleblower's attorney, the coup has started and impeachment will follow. But after listening for what is going on now 4 hours and 21 minutes, after all of the secret hearings, after all of the leaks, after hearing witnesses such as yourselves give your opinions, it really comes down to this. One thing it comes down to. This is the transcript that the president has released of this phone call. There is one sentence, one phone call. That is what this entire impeachment proceeding is based upon. And I got to tell you, if your impeachment case is so weak that you have to lie and exaggerate about it to convince the American people that they need to remove this president, then you've got a problem. And the American people have been lied to again and again on this. We first heard a lot about quid pro quo. And then many people realized that was meaningless. So they said, well, let's go for the fences then. Let's talk about extortion. Let's talk about bribery. Let's talk about cover-up and obstruction, for which there is zero evidence of any of that. We heard a characterization of the president's phone call that was so outrageously inaccurate, it had to be described as a parody. Zero evidence of any. And none of those things matter. None of it matters. It comes down to this. We appreciate your insight. We appreciate your opinion. But all you can do is give your opinion of this one phone call. Let me ask you, gentlemen, both of you have said here today, you have testified, corruption in Ukraine is endemic. Would we agree on that? Simple question. Problem is, isn't it?
It's a problem, and they're taking steps to address it.
Okay, earlier in the hearing, both of you said, use the word endemic or agreed to it. It's in the courts, it's oligarchs, it's prosecutors, it's everywhere. And I think we can also agree that that's not the only place in the world where we experience and see corruption. There's dozens and dozens of nations around the world that are steeped in corruption. Would you agree with that?
Mr. I would say that there's corruption in every country, including ours.
Okay, thank you. And some we're clearly more concerned about than others. So in these corrupt nations, of which there are probably hundreds of corrupt individuals, hundreds of corrupt government officials, can you give me an example any time where the Vice President of the United States shows up and demands that a specific prosecutor be fired and gives them a 6-hour time limit to do that? Are you aware of that ever happening any other place? I guess the answer is no. And I just think it's interesting that out of hundreds of corrupt individuals, dozens of corrupt nations, that happened one time. And it happened with the individual whose son was being paid by the organization that was under investigation. One other thing very quickly. If someone was a candidate for a political office, even for president of the United States, should they be immune from investigation?
No one is above the law, sir.
Thank you. I agree with that. I think we all would agree with that. And yet I think some presume that because some of the individuals we're talking about here were candidates, that they are immune from any questions or any investigation. I think it's absurd. For heaven's sakes, if those of us in public office, those of us who find ourselves up for re-election or all the time as a candidate, I think we have a higher standard not immunity from asking these types of questions. The last thing, then I'm going to yield my time. Availability of funds, I'm quoting from the NDAA in 2019. The language is specific. Availability of funds under assistance to the Ukraine, it has to be certified. And what has to be certified? Quote, for the purposes of decreasing corruption. Are you surprised that there would be questions about corruption in Ukraine and that it would be discussed withholding some of this aid that's actually required by law that it be withheld if they can't certify that corruption has been eliminated or is being addressed?
The certification in that case is done by the Secretary of Defense upon advice of his staff in consultation with the interagency community. We were fully supportive of that conditionality, and the Secretary of Defense had already certified that that conditionality had been met.
And so we agree that we should withhold funds if there's questions about corruption that have not been addressed. I'm going to yield my rest of my time to Mr. Jordan. Sorry, 18 seconds. You're going to let that go? Thank you. In that case, I will yield back. Thank you.
Mr. Quigley.
So that certification, that took place in May, is that correct, Mr. Kent?
I do not believe it was certified by May. I would defer to my colleague Laura Cooper, who's testified on closed door. But
it was
no,
an earlier time.
It had not been done by May because when I was visiting in May, I was asked by Laura to raise a specific issue that would meet the conditionality.
But the DOD did say that they met the certification.
Yes, sir. I think it may have been in the July timeframe.
Thank you. So it's interesting and curious that we're talking about hearsay evidence. It is extraordinary to me that the committee's been able to get as much information as they had, direct or hearsay, given the obstruction. You gentlemen were both asked by the State Department not to appear for your depositions. Is that correct?
We both received, I believe, I received initially a letter directing me not to appear, and once the committees issued a subpoena, I was under legal obligation to appear, and I am here today under subpoena.
Ambassador, were you also asked not to be part of the deposition?
Mr. Quigley, I was told by the State Department, don't appear under these circumstances. That was in the letter to me, and when I got the subpoena, exactly as Mr. Kent said, that was different circumstances and obeyed a legal subpoena. So that, yes, sir, I'm here for that reason.
Absolutely, but we were not able to hear testimony by Chief of Staff Mulvaney, John Eisenberg, Michael Ellis, John Bolton, more than a dozen witnesses. So I suspect if you have a problem with hearsay, you'd have a lot more direct testimony and direct evidence if you weren't blocking that ability. You'd have a lot more documents that you referred to with my colleagues' questions that have not yet been turned over by state or any other agency. Is that correct to your knowledge, gentlemen?
We're both here under subpoena. I don't think either of us is going to comment why others have not shown up.
But has any of the documents that you turned over, to your knowledge, been turned over to the committee?
No.
Mr. Kent, following the July 25th call and through the first 2 weeks of August, were you involved in any efforts to arrange for President Zelensky to make a statement announcing the 2 investigations that President Trump had talked about in the July 25th call?
I was not, and I would never participate in an arrangement to have them announce investigations.
Ambassador Taylor, were you involved in any such efforts?
No, sir.
I want to show you a text of the exchange. This one's between Ambassador Volker and Andrei Yermak, the same aide to Zelensky that Volker texted before the July 25th call. You weren't involved with it, so I'll read it. The first text is from August 10th. Ambassador Volker text, I agree with your approach. Let's iron out the statement and use that to get date and Prez can go forward with it. Then at 5:42, Mr. Yermak responds, once we have a date, we'll call for a press briefing announcing upcoming visit and outlining vision for a reboot of U.S.-Ukraine relationship, including, among other things, Burisma and election meddling investigations. Andrei Yermak says that once we have a date, they will announce the investigations in Burisma and election meddling. Mr. Kent, are these the same 2 investigations President Trump asked the Ukrainian president to initiate in the July 25th meeting, 25th call?
Those appear to be the same issues that were mentioned in the call, as well as the media campaign that started in March led by Rudy Giuliani.
Mr. Kent, as the day-to-day State Department point person in Washington on Ukraine policy, were you aware of this effort to persuade President Zelensky to issue a statement in order to get a White House meeting while they were happening?
When this exchange happened on August 10th, I was not.
When did you learn about them?
As Ambassador Taylor referenced earlier in his testimony and oral answering, he heard on August 16th. He then called me and we had a conversation. And at that point, I memorialized my concerns in a note to the file.
Ambassador Taylor, as the point person on the ground in Ukraine, were you aware of this effort to get Ukraine to issue this written statement in early August?
Not the written statement, no, sir.
So the entire discussion about a public statement about the two investigations President Trump wanted was done in what you have described as an irregular channel involving Ambassadors Sondland and Volker, and they tasked to take on Ukraine policy by the president. Isn't that correct, Mr. Kent?
That would be my understanding.
Ambassador?
The same.
And if, I guess to close, primer on hearsay, I think the American public needs to be reminded that countless people have been convicted on hearsay because the courts have routinely allowed and created needed exceptions to hearsay. Hearsay can be much better evidence than direct, as we have learned in painful instances, and it's certainly valid in this instance.
Well, gentlemen, yield because none of those exceptions would apply to this testimony.
It's not the time for colloquy. Representative Stefanik, you're recognized.
Thank you. For the millions of Americans viewing today, the two most important facts are the following. Number one, Ukraine received the aid. Number two, there was in fact no investigation into Biden. Mr. Kent and Ambassador Taylor, you both spoke eloquently and passionately about the need to support Ukraine to counter Russian aggression, particularly during this very critical time. I agree with you in that assessment. And isn't it the case that the Trump administration has indeed provided substantial aid to Ukraine in the form of defensive lethal aid, correct?
That is correct.
And that is more so than the Obama administration, correct?
The Trump
Defensive lethal aid.
Yes.
And in the transcript of the president's July 25th call with President Zelensky tells Trump they are ready to buy more javelins. This is indeed the most effective weapon for fighting insurgent armor Russian tanks. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And those javelins were not made available to Ukraine under the Obama administration. The javelins were not made available.
They were not.
Correct. Shifting gears to corruption. One of the themes here today is that of rooting out corruption, which is an important tool for the president as we provide taxpayer-funded aid to foreign countries. Mr. Kent, you would characterize Ukraine as having long-standing corruption issues, correct?
I did.
And in fact, you testified, quote, I would say that corruption is part of the reason why Ukrainians came out to the streets in both 2004 when somebody tried to steal the election and again in 2014 because of a corrupt, kleptocratic, pro-Russian government which eventually collapsed. The Ukrainians decided enough was enough. Is that your testimony?
It remains so.
And you testified that you first came to learn about Burisma in 2015 when you were the senior anti-corruption coordinator, correct?
Correct. Detailed to the embassy in Kyiv as the acting deputy chief of mission.
And you testified that the issue of corruption in Burisma was in the U.S. interest because, quote, and this is from your deposition, we had made a commitment to the Ukrainian government in 2014 to try to recover an estimated tens of billions of dollars of stolen assets out of the country. Is that correct?
That is stolen assets that were in the name of the owner of Burisma, Mykola Zlochevsky. He was the one who we believed had stolen the money.
Sure. So the first case, this was the first case that the U.S., the UK, and Ukraine investigators worked on was against the owner of Burisma.
That's correct.
And this was during the Obama administration.
That's correct.
So for the millions of Americans viewing, the first investigation against the owner of Burisma was under President Obama's administration.
That's correct.
You testified also, quote, we spent roughly $500,000 of State Department money in support of the FBI and this investigation to build capacity and track down stolen assets, end quote. Is that correct?
That's correct. It was launched in May 2014 by the Attorney General of the U.S. and U.K. In conjunction with the World Bank.
And in fact, by 2016, you were so concerned about corruption questions related to Burisma that when there was an effort by Burisma to sponsor an essay contest with USAID, you asked USAID to stop it.
That's correct.
And you testified that it was because, quote, Burisma had a poor reputation in the business, and that you didn't think it was appropriate for the U.S. government to be co-sponsoring something with a company that had a bad reputation. Correct? You are also aware, and you testified today, that Hunter Biden served on the board of Burisma.
Correct.
And you also testified that you were indeed concerned about the appearance of conflict of interest.
That's correct.
And broadly, this is very important, you testified in your deposition that when the State Department evaluates foreign assistance, it is appropriate for them to look at levels of corruption in countries.
That's correct.
And lastly, you also testified that, and this is your quote, issues of corruption have been part of high-level dialogue between U.S. leaders and Ukrainian leaders, regardless of who is the U.S. leader and who is the Ukrainian leader, and that is a normal issue of diplomatic discussion at the highest level, end quote. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I will yield 30 seconds. You know what, I will yield back after that. Thank you.
Mr. Swalwell.
Both of you have testified that you are not direct witnesses who've spoken with President Trump. However, you are witnesses to a shakedown scheme that others participated in who spoke with President Trump. However, Ambassador Bolton and Mick Mulvaney both spoke directly to President Trump, and unlike you, they have refused to honor our request for them to be a part of these proceedings. Nonetheless, we do know how Acting Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney feels about aid because on October 17 at a press conference, he discussed the hold on security assistance for Ukraine. And Ambassador Taylor, I'd like you to listen to what he said. I'll read it for you. It's in response to a question, but to be clear, what you just described is a quid pro quo. It is, funding will not flow unless the investigation into the Democratic server happens as well. In response to that question, Mr. Mulvaney said, Mr. Taylor, we do that all the time with foreign policy. My question, Ambassador Taylor, the president conditioning security assistance on an investigation into his political opponent prior to this administration, is this something we would do all the time?
No, sir.
Why not?
We condition assistance on issues that will improve our foreign policy, serve our foreign policy, ensure that taxpayers' money is well spent. Those are and those conditions are either coming from the Congress or from policy decisions stemming from authority Congress has given us to make sure that the taxpayers' money is well spent, or that the receiving country takes the actions in our national interest.
And you described in your text message exchanges that engaging in a scheme like this is, quote, crazy. Can we also agree that it's just wrong?
Yes.
Why is it wrong?
Again, our holding up of security assistance that would go to a country that is fighting aggression from Russia for no good policy reason, no good substantive reason, no good national security reason is wrong.
Mr. Mulvaney in the same news conference said, quote, if you read the news reports and you believe them, what McKinley said yesterday, well, McKinley said yesterday that he was really upset with the political influence in foreign policy. That was one of the reasons he was so upset about this. And I have news for everybody. Get over it. There's going to be political influence in foreign policy. Ambassador Taylor, should we get over it?
If we're talking about political influence, meaning attempts to get information that is solely useful for political campaigns, if that's what he's talking about, we should not get used to that.
Finally, Mr. Mulvaney said, again, I was involved with the process by which the money was held up temporarily, okay? 3 issues for that. The corruption of the country, whether or not the countries were participating in the support of Ukraine, and whether or not they were cooperating in an ongoing investigation with our Department of Justice. That's completely legitimate. Mr. Kent, were you aware of any formal Department of Justice cooperation request made to the Ukrainians?
I am not aware that there was any formal Department of Justice request in this matter, no.
Was Mr. Mulvaney's statement false?
I think you'd refer that question again to the Department of Justice, since I don't have full knowledge of whatever they may have been working on.
Just about an hour before the two of you sat down to testify today, the president tweeted multiple times about this hearing, and he put in all caps, "Never Trumpers." Mr. Kent, are you a never Trumper?
I am a career non-professional who serves whatever president is duly elected and carries out the foreign policies of that president in the United States, and I've done that for 27 years for 3 Republican presidents and 2 Democrat presidents.
Ambassador Taylor, are you a never Trumper?
No, sir.
Ambassador Taylor, finally, you said in your statement on page 19, Mr. Chairman, there are 2 Ukrainian stories today. The first is the one we are discussing this morning and that you have been hearing for the past 2 weeks. It's a rancorous story about whistleblowers. Mr. Giuliani, side channels, quid pro quos, corruption, and interference in elections. In this story, Ukraine is merely an object. Is it also true that in this story, it's about the President of the United States?
Mr. Sawa, I'm here to tell you what I know, and I'm here to tell you what I heard and what I said. And in that regard, I can't answer that question.
But what you've testified to also involves the President of the United States. Is that correct?
The President of the United States was on the telephone call on the 25th of July. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Hurt.
Thank you, Chairman. Gentlemen, I appreciate y'all's decade of service. As the fabled Foreign Service officer, Ambassador Ryan Crocker, says, because we have pumps and wingtips on the ground, meaning diplomats, that prevents us from having the need to have boots on the ground, the military. Y'all are an important role in our national security, and thank you and your colleagues. Mr. Taylor, my first questions are to you, and these are questions that are on years prior to your time in the Ukraine, but I'm pretty sure you can answer them. Did the Ukrainians get aid in FY17?
Did they get any aid in FY17?
Yeah.
Any? Yes, sir. They did get assistance.
And they got security assistance as well.
They did.
And if I said that number was circa, in military assistance, around 270 million, would that probably be accurate? Mr.
Close.
Kent, about right?
Yeah.
Did they get aid in FY18?
Yes, sir.
Including security assistance?
Including security assistance.
We've already talked about the javelins, the anti-tank missiles that they were not able to purchase in previous administrations. Have they gotten security assistance in FY19?
Yes, sir.
Prior to the 400,000 million or so that we're discussing or been discussing a lot here today?
They got some previous year, some probably FY18 assistance, but George, you may know.
It takes a while once money is obligated to actually reach the country. There were 2 island-class ships that just arrived in the port of Odessa,
Sure.
And that was with prior year money. So there's about a lag of a year.
My point is that we have been supporting the Ukrainians under this administration in order to help them kick out the Russians who invaded their country.
Yes, sir.
100%.
Ambassador Taylor, you earlier testified that Ukrainian officials did not become aware of potential U.S. assistance being withheld until August 29th. Is that accurate?
That's my understanding, Mr. Hurd.
Would you find it surprising if a Ukrainian official knew about that sooner and did not contact you?
I can answer that. It was only after August 29th, when the political article came out, that I got calls from several of the Ukrainian officials.
Good copy. Mr. Kent, had you had any Ukrainian official contacting you concerned about, when was the first time a Ukrainian official contacted you concerned about potential withholding of U.S. aid?
It was after the article in Political came out in that first intense week of September.
Gotcha. So after that August 29th conversation. There's a lot of talk about Rudy Giuliani and who he was and wasn't meeting. Do we know or have an idea of the Ukrainian officials that he was meeting with over the last couple of years?
I don't, sir.
Have you had any Ukrainian officials call you after a meeting with Rudy Giuliani concerned about the nature or the context of that conversation?
Yes, Mr. Yermak has expressed concern about his interactions with Mr. Giuliani.
And I believe that meeting was somewhere in late August, is that correct?
There were meetings and there were, I think, also phone calls.
And y'all have talked many times that y'all are still concerned about corruption in Ukraine, is that correct?
Sir.
Have we seen whatever this anti-corruption statement we wanted the Ukrainians to make?
Are you referring to the statement that was being negotiated between Kurt Volker, Gordon Sondland, and Andrei Yermak?
Yes.
That was not an anti-corruption statement, sir.
What was the statement?
I think if you go back to the back and forth of WhatsApps that were shared by Kurt Volker, they shared a draft with Rudy Giuliani, and Rudy Giuliani said it would not be acceptable if it didn't mention Biden-Burisma in 2016.
But that statement was never agreed to or was never issued by the Ukrainian officials? Is that correct?
No statement of that sort was issued, correct.
And have U.S. businesses ever contacted y'all concerned about corruption within Ukraine?
Yes, sir.
As of this year even?
Yes, sir.
Because the concern is not just how Ukrainian businesses run by oligarchs are being operated. It's also concerns about how the Ukrainian government is dealing with American businesses trying to operate in Ukraine. Is that accurate?
American businesses are very concerned about the judicial system in particular. Yes, sir.
I yield back the time I do not have, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman, Mr. Castro.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for your testimony today and for your service to our country. Listening to all the evidence, everything I've heard and read in this investigation, it seems to me that the President of the United States either committed extortion and bribery of a foreign official or attempted extortion and bribery of a foreign official. When President Trump got President Zelensky on the phone on July 25th, he was talking to a desperate man, wasn't he? President Zelensky was desperate to protect his country and make sure that he had foreign assistance from the United States. Is that right?
President Zelensky is very interested in U.S. support, both assistance and political support. Yes,
what would have happened if the aid had gotten cut off, Ambassador? What would have happened to President Zelensky's career, and what would have happened to the Ukraine?
The assistance, if the assistance had been cut off, he would have been much weaker in his negotiations with the Russians. He would have been much weaker on the battlefield.
The Russians may have taken it as an invitation to actually take military action against Ukraine. Is that right?
The Russians always look for vulnerabilities, and they know that the United States has supported Ukraine. If the Russians determine or suspect that that support is lessened or not there, they will likely take advantage.
They could have pounced.
They could have taken advantage.
So he had a desperate man on the phone, and he asked a desperate man for a favor. And based on your testimony, it sounds like, begrudgingly, President Zelensky may have actually agreed to do that favor and investigate the Bidens and Burisma. Is that right?
President Zelensky does say in the transcript that he will pursue the investigations.
So we know that President Trump asked for a favor to help his political career, and it appears as though the president of the Ukraine agreed to that favor. Do we know why it didn't actually happen? Do we know why there was no announcement in front of CNN or to CNN about an investigation?
Mr. Castro, as we've determined, as we've discussed here, on September 11th, just before any CNN discussion or interview, the hold was released. The hold on the security systems was released.
But we don't, so the hold was released. Is it possible that the White House released that hold because they knew that a whistleblower had basically turned this in?
I don't know, sir.
Do you think that's possible?
I'm not in a position to judge.
So we have a president who the other side has claimed or has defended the president saying that the aid went through, that there was never any investigation. But the president attempted to get those things done. And it looks like there was an initial agreement by the president of the Ukraine to actually do those things. So, ambassadors, is attempted murder a crime? Is attempted murder a crime?
Attempted murder is a crime.
Is attempted robbery a crime?
Neither of us is a lawyer, but
I think anybody in this room could answer that
I
question.
think that's right. And I'll go out on a limb and say, yes, it is.
Is attempted extortion and bribery a crime?
I don't know, sir.
In the minute that I have left, I want you to speak to the nation about what's at stake, Ambassador Kent. You said in your opening statement, you warned about selective prosecutions and a president of the United States going after specific Americans abroad. If this Congress clears President Trump, does it mean that he can go ask another foreign country to investigate another presidential candidate, a member of Congress, a governor, a senator, or any private American citizen doing business overseas? If there's no consequence for a president who does that, then it means there's a green light, doesn't it, for any president to ask any country to go prosecute or investigate an American citizen for political and personal gain of that president. Doesn't it?
Thank you for the question. First of all, I'm not an ambassador.
I'm sorry, Deputy Secretary.
I will repeat, I think on principle, regardless of the country, whether it's Ukraine, the U.S., or any country, the facts of law, criminal nexus should drive investigations by law enforcement officials, and it is not the role of politicians to be involved in directing the judicial systems of their own country or other countries.
I yield back, Chairman.
Mr. Ratcliffe. Thank the chair. Mr. Kent, in your prior deposition on page 159, you were asked about the president's authority to release an ambassador for any reason. And your response was, quote, all ambassadors serve at the pleasure of the president, and that is without question. Everybody understands that, end quote. Do you remember saying that?
I do, and it's true.
President very clearly has that constitutional authority, correct?
He does.
Okay, well, most everybody apparently understands that, but it doesn't include House Democrats. In the context of this impeachment inquiry, specifically addressing Ambassador Yovanovitch, who I know is a friend of yours, in alleging an abuse of power in a nationally televised interview, a member of this committee said, quote, it's an abuse of power to remove an ambassador for political reasons because you don't like what they're doing, period, end quote. That's not true, is it?
Again, I go back to what I said. The president has the right to have ambassadors serve at his pleasure.
Okay, so you agree with me that we shouldn't impeach a president for exercising his constitutional authority?
I'm here as a fact witness to answer your questions. Your constitutional obligation is to consider the evidence before you.
So when did Ambassador Yovanovitch get recalled from Ukraine?
I believe a message was sent on or about April 24th.
Okay. Certainly well before the July 25th call that's in question here, correct?
Without a doubt.
Okay, and she had no remaining responsibilities with respect to Ukraine policy for that 3 or 4 months in between, I take it.
She is now she was transferred to a teaching slot at Georgetown, where her responsibilities, among others, were to teach a class on Ukraine.
Okay, so if President Trump had the constitutional authority to remove her, as he did months before the call, and she wasn't in the Ukraine or have any responsibilities on July 25th, do you have an explanation for why Democrats are calling her as a witness on Friday?
I'm here as a fact witness under subpoena, and that's a question you could perhaps direct towards your Democratic colleagues.
Ambassador Taylor, we've established that on July 25th, both participants in the call, both presidents, expressly have stated there was no pressure, no demand, no conditions, no blackmail, no corruption. And I asked you again specifically about a quid pro quo even being possible. And I think we've agreed that it wasn't possible a quid pro quo involving military aid on July 25th, given President Zelensky's lack of knowledge, correct?
President Zelensky, to my knowledge, did not have any idea that the security systems was on hold.
Okay. So do you have an explanation for why within days of that phone call, when no quid pro quo was even possible, a person who later became a whistleblower walked into Chairman Schiff's staff to discuss what Chairman Schiff's spokesman, Patrick Boland, said were the, quote, outlines of the whistleblower's accusations?
I'm sorry, what's the question, sir?
Question is, do you know or have an explanation for why that person would walk in a few days later to Chairman Schiff's office?
I do not.
Okay. Earlier, Chairman Schiff made reference to a colloquy, and for the public, a colloquy is a way for legislators to clarify an important issue to the public. And so without jeopardizing the whistleblower in any way, in an effort to find out, Chairman, what you knew and when you knew it about the whistleblower, I'd like you to engage in a colloquy with me.
My colleague will address his questions to the witnesses.
I'll take that as a no, you're not interested in a colloquy?
Mr. Ratcliffe, you could take it any way you like it, but appropriately, your question should be directed to witnesses.
Well, I guess my question to the witnesses then is, when are House Republicans going to find out what House Democrats already know? When are we going to find out the details of the contact between Chairman Schiff and the whistleblower? What they met about, when they met, the number of times they met, the discussions that were had.
Mr. Chairman, point of order.
Point of order.
Mr. Chairman, the gentleman is questioning the chair, which is not permitted under the resolution applicable to the hearing or the rules of the House or the committee. The efforts to undermine lawful whistleblowing is, moreover, contrary to the law and practice of this committee. And I would like to also quote, Mr. Chairman,
I'm not trying to find out the identity. I want to find out the date that this happened.
Both gentlemen could suspend. Mr. Ratcliffe has resumed questioning of the witness, so I would just recommend we move on.
Chairman, pretty simple question. Are we ever going to be able to find out the details in
I guess
not anything classified?
Mr. Chairman, I'll reserve my point of order.
I guess he hasn't resumed his questioning of the witness. Mr. Ratcliffe, your time is dwindling. I suggest you use it.
I'll yield back.
Mr. Heck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Kent, some people have suggested that the real reason that President Trump's pressure campaign on the Ukraine was to root out corruption in Ukraine. I've gone back and read the memorandum of call 2 or 3 times, actually, and I don't recall a single instance where the president ever used the word corruption nor the word corrupt. I know in answer to the chairman's opening questions, you indicated you had gone back and read it about a month ago. Do you recall the president in that July 25th phone call with President Zelensky ever uttering the word corrupt or corruption?
I don't recall, but it would be a matter of record now that it's been released.
And as a matter of record, he didn't, but he did manage to find time to mention his potential political rival in 2020. You also answered in response to the question from Mr. Himes that you've been working on the issue of corruption literally for decades. I thank you for that on behalf of the American people. And indeed, on October 15th, you testified about longstanding U.S. policy meant to combat corruption in the Ukraine, championed by people such as former Ambassador Maria Yovanovitch. But, Mr. Kent, is it not true that rather than fighting corruption in general in Ukraine, that what President Trump actually did was unceremoniously recall and remove Ambassador Yovanovitch from her post in Ukraine?
I would say, first of all, as I repeated before, the president has the right to recall ambassadors. It remains a matter of policy of the United States towards Ukraine to help them overcome a legacy of corruption and creating new institutions. And much of what we've been discussing today, which involved an irregular channel, was a request that went against U.S. policy that would have undermined the rule of law and our longstanding policy goals in Ukraine, as in other countries in the post-Soviet space.
Those policies which were indeed championed by Ambassador Yovanovitch. You also testified on October 15th in the deposition about fundamental reforms necessary for Ukraine to fight corruption and to transform the country. And you cited the importance of reforming certain institutions, notably the security service and the prosecutor general's office. Was investigating President Trump's political opponents a part of those necessary reforms? Was it on that list of yours, sir, or indeed was it on any list?
No, they weren't.
In fact, historically, is it not true that a major problem in the Ukraine has been its misuse of prosecutors precisely to conduct investigation of political opponents? That's a legacy, I dare suggest, from the Soviet era, when, as you stated in your testimony, prosecutors like the KGB were, and I quote you now, instruments of oppression. Is that
I said
correct,
that,
sir?
and I believe it's true.
So finally, Mr. Kent, for as long as I can remember, U.S. foreign policy has been predicated on advancing principled interest in democratic values, notably freedom of speech, press, assembly, religion, free, fair, and open elections, and the rule of law. Mr. Kent, when American leaders ask foreign governments to investigate their potential rivals, doesn't that make it harder for us to advocate on behalf of those democratic values?
I believe it makes it more difficult for our diplomatic representatives overseas to carry out those policy goals, yes.
How is that, sir?
Well, there's an issue of credibility. They hear diplomats on the ground saying one thing, and they hear other U.S. leaders saying something else.
Ambassador Taylor, would you agree with that, sir?
I would.
Is there anything you'd like to add about how it might make it more difficult for you to do your job, sir?
Our credibility is based on a respect for the United States. And if we damage that respect, then it hurts our credibility and makes it more difficult for us to do our jobs.
Anyone looking at the facts can see what happened was an abuse of power. Anyone looking at the facts can see that what happened was unethical. Anyone looking at the facts can see, anyone looking at the facts can see that what went on was just plain wrong. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 55 days. 55 days between July 18th and September 11th that there was a delay on sending hard-earned tax dollars of the American people to Ukraine. We're not talking any country, we're talking Ukraine. Ernst & Young said one of the 3 most corrupt countries on the planet. Our witness on Friday, she testified in her deposition, corruption is not just prevalent in Ukraine, it's the system. So our president said, time out. Time out. Let's check out this new guy. Let's see if Zelensky's the real deal. This new guy who got elected in April, whose party took power in July, let's see if he's legitimate. Now keep in mind, as has already been discussed, in 2018, President Trump had already done more for Ukraine than Obama did. That's right. President Trump, who doesn't like foreign aid, who wanted European countries to do more, who knew how corrupt Ukraine was, did more than Obama because he gave him javelins, tank-busting javelins to fight the Russians. Our witnesses have said this, others have said this. Obama gave him blankets, Trump gave him missiles. But when it came time to check out this new guy, President Trump said, let's just see if he's legit. So for 55 days, we checked him out. President Zelensky had 5 interactions with senior U.S. officials in that time frame. One was, of course, the phone call, the July 25th phone call between President Trump and President Zelensky. And there were 4 other face-to-face meetings with other senior U.S. officials. And guess what? Not one of those interactions, not one, were security assistance dollars linked to investigating Burisma or Biden. But guess what did happen in those 55 days? U.S. senators, Ambassador Bolton, Vice President Pence, all became convinced that Zelensky was in fact worth the risk. He was in fact legit and the real deal and a real change. And guess what? They told the president, he's a reformer, release the money. And that's exactly what President Trump did. Now, over the next few weeks, we're going to have more witnesses like we've had today that the Democrats will parade in here, and they're all going to say this: so-and-so said such and such to so-and-so, and therefore we got to impeach the president. Actually, we can get more specific. We covered this a little bit ago. They'll say something like Ambassador Sondland said in his deposition, where he said, Ambassador Taylor recalls that Mr. Morrison told Ambassador Taylor that I told Mr. Morrison that I conveyed this message to Mr. Yarmouk on September 1st, 2019 in connection with Vice President Pence's visit to Warsaw and a meeting with President Zelensky. And if you can follow that, that's the Democrats' plan and why they want to impeach the president. That's what we're going to hear over the next couple weeks. That's what we're going to hear. But no matter what they do, no matter how many witnesses they bring in here, 4 facts will not change, have not changed, will never change. The call shows no linkage between dollars and the investigation into Burisma or the Bidens. President Trump and President Zelensky have both said on the call there was no linkage, there was no pressure, there was no pushing. Ukrainians didn't even know the aid was withheld at the time of the phone call, and most importantly, as has been pointed out, Ukrainians didn't take any specific action relative to investigations to get the money released. Now, there is one witness that they won't bring in front of us. They won't bring in front of the American people. And that's the guy who started it all, the whistleblower. Nope. 435 members of Congress, only one gets to know who that person is. Only one member of Congress has a staff that gets to talk to that person. The rest of us don't. Only Chairman Schiff knows who the whistleblower is. We don't. We will never get the chance. We will never get the chance to see the whistleblower raise his right hand, swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth. We'll never get that chance. More importantly, the American people won't get that chance. This anonymous so-called whistleblower with no firsthand knowledge, who's biased against the president, who worked with Joe Biden, who is the reason we're all sitting here today, will never get a chance to question that individual. Democrats are trying to impeach the president based on all that, 11 and a half months before an election. We'll not get to check out his credibility, his motivations, his bias. I said this last week, but this is a sad day. This is a sad day for this country. You think about what the Democrats have put our nation through for the last 3 years. Started July of 2016 when they spied on 2 American citizens associated with the presidential campaign, and all that unfolded with the Mueller investigation after that. And when that didn't work, here we are. Based on this. The American people see through all this. They understand the facts support the president. They understand this process is unfair. And they see through the whole darn sham. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Welch.
Thank you. I say to my colleague, I'd be glad to have the person who started it all come in and testify. President Trump is welcome to take a seat right there. You know, the question here is not a dispute about the enormous power that a president has. The question is whether, in this case, there was an abuse of that power. A president can fire an ambassador for any reason whatsoever. A president can change his policy, as he did when he opened the door for Turkey to go in and invade Kurdistan, despite opposition from many of his senior advisors. A president could change his position and our position on Ukraine. But is there a limit? There is, because our Constitution says no one is above the law. And that limit is that one cannot, even as president, use the public trust of high office for personal gain. The law prohibits any one of us here on the dais from seeking foreign assistance in our campaigns. The question for us is whether the use of power by the president was for the benefit of advancing his political interest in the 2020 campaign. And by the way, to my colleagues, if the president wants to attack Joe Biden and his son, he's free to do it, all fair and square in campaigns. He's just not free to change our foreign policy unless he gets his way to assist him in that campaign. That's the line he can't cross. Now, you all have been very clear about what our continuous foreign policy was. And Ambassador Taylor, just very quickly describe why us withholding aid interfered with achieving our national security goals.
Mr. Welch, one of our national security goals is to resolve conflicts in Europe. There is one major conflict in Europe. It's a fighting war. Our national security goals in support of Ukraine, in support of a broader strategic approach to Europe, is to facilitate that negotiation, is to try to support Ukraine when it negotiates with the Russians.
And I want to go back, because in the historical context, Mr. Kent, that you and Ambassador Taylor provided, we had 70 years of peace after the war in which we lost over 400,000 American lives. And that took care. And that was in jeopardy, as you described it, Ambassador Taylor. And that threatened each and every one of us up here in the constituents we represent. Is that a fair statement?
That's a fair statement.
I want to do 3 dates, too. I only have a little time, but July 24, July 25, and July 26. July 24th, Director Mueller testified about his investigation, and he established beyond doubt that it was the Russians who interfered in our election. And he expressed a fear that would be the new normal. On July 25th, according to the readout of the president's campaign, he asked the Ukrainians to investigate Ukrainian interference in our election that had been repudiated. And then on July 26, as I understand it, this person who reported to you heard the president saying he wanted investigations again in Ukraine. So this is the question. The new normal that Director Mueller feared, is there a new normal that you fear that a president, any president, can use congressionally approved foreign aid as a lever to get personal advantage in something that is in his interest but not the public interest?
That should not be the case, Mr. Welch.
I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the transcript from the July 25th call between President Trump and President Zelensky. You yourself, Mr. Chairman, have mischaracterized the call. In fact, in the first open hearing, you had a parody.
The gentlewoman will suspend. By unanimous consent, be happy to enter the call record into the record. Mr. Maloney, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for being here today. Pastor Taylor, what year did you graduate from West Point?
1969, sir.
It was the height of the Vietnam War, wasn't it, sir?
The height was about that time.
What was your class rank at West Point?
I was number 5.
How many people were in your class?
800.
800 cadets, you were number 5.
Yes, sir.
So when you're top 1% of your class at West Point, you probably get your pick of assignments, but you picked the infantry.
I did, sir. Yes, sir.
You were a rifle company commander?
Sir.
Where'd you serve?
In Vietnam.
Did you see combat in Vietnam, sir?
I did.
Did you earn any accommodations for that service?
I was awarded the Combat Infantryman's Badge, which is my highest, I'm proudest of. There was a Bronze Star, there was an Air Medal with V.
That's for valor, isn't it, sir?
It is.
Let's talk about July 26th, a lot of years later. You go to the front, you go to Donbass with Ambassador Volker, I believe, and you're on the bridge and you're looking over on the front line at the Russian soldiers. Is that what you recalled?
Yes, sir.
And you said the commander there, the Ukrainian commander, thanked you for the American military assistance that you knew was being withheld at that moment.
That's correct.
How'd that make you feel, sir?
Badly.
Why?
Because it was clear that that commander counted on us. It was clear that that commander had confidence in us. It was clear that that commander was appreciative of the capabilities that he was given by that assistance, but also the reassurance that we were supporting him.
You don't strike me as a quitter, Ambassador, but you threatened to resign, or you mentioned it in your statement. Before I ask you about that, let's just talk about a couple days later, on 1 month later, on August 28th. You find yourself in Ukraine with the National Security Advisor, Mr. Bolton, right?
Yes, sir.
And you convey to him your concerns. You've testified to this previously about the withholding of military assistance. What does he say to you?
He says that he shares my concern, and he advises me to express that in a very special way to the Secretary of State.
Now, he's the National Security Advisor, works directly with the President, but he tells you that you should bring it up with the Secretary of State.
Yes, sir.
Have you ever sent a cable like that? How many times in your career, 40, 50 years, have you sent a cable directly to the Secretary of State?
Once.
This time?
Yes, sir.
In 50 years?
Rifle company commanders don't send cables, but yes, sir.
So the National Security Advisor, who could tell it to the President himself and who shares your concern, says you, the ambassador serving in Ukraine, should cable the Secretary of State directly, and you do so, don't you?
Yes, sir.
What'd the cable say, sir?
It's classified cable.
Without going into classified information?
Without going into classified, it says security assistance, it's what we've been talking about today. Security assistance to Ukraine at this particular time, as in previous time, is very important. Ukraine, I also make the point that we've also talked about here today, Ukraine is important for our national security, and we should support it. So not to provide that would be folly.
Did you get an answer to your cable?
Not directly, no, sir.
Do you know what happened to it?
Secretary Kent.
Secretary Kent, do you know what happened to it?
Tells me that.
Yeah, I was on vacation when his cable came in, but my understanding is it made it to its recipient, intended recipient, Secretary Pompeo. And we know Secretary Pompeo was on the call a month earlier on July 25th. It's not like he's in the dark about any of this. What did he do with it? I honestly can't say for sure what happened with the cable once the message was brought in at the highest level. One other question, gentlemen. On September 1st, you recall a meeting between the Vice President and the President of Ukraine, Mr. Zelensky, in which, right off the bat, the President of Ukraine raises security assistance. And the Vice President, according to your telling, says, I'll talk to the President tonight about that. I'll make a call. Do you know whether the Vice President made that call?
I don't know, sir.
Do you know what, if anything, the Vice President had to do with any of this? What more can you tell us about the Vice President's role in this? Do you know if he ever raised this issue with anyone in the administration, whether he ever pushed for the release of that security assistance?
I can't, sir.
I believe, to the best of my understanding, the Vice President was an advocate for the release of the assistance. Thank you. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Demings, you're
Mr. Chairman, I have a unanimous consent request.
The General will state his request.
I ask unanimous consent to submit for the record the Politico article on Ukraine boosting the Clinton campaign, authored by Ken Vogel,
Without
now
objection.
at the New York Times.
That will be entered into the record.
Thank you.
Representative Demings.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to both of you for being with us today. Mr. Kent, you said that a president has the right to remove an ambassador because the ambassador served at the pleasure of the president. Is that correct?
That is correct, ma'am.
Does that removal usually come with the smear campaign of that ambassador by the president?
I think the right of the president to make a decision about the president's personal representative, as confirmed by the Senate, is separate from whatever happens outside the confines of U.S. government processes.
Do you have any idea why it was important to discredit Ambassador Yovanovitch, what she was not willing to do or to do, why that was important?
Well, I guess it probably depends on the motivation of other people, and I am not one of them.
The committee's investigation has uncovered a web of shadow diplomacy engaged in and executed by several State Department officials and the president's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, and ultimately directed by President Trump. We have heard several ways of describing this shady shadow operation, shadow diplomacy, rogue back channel. Ambassador Taylor, you have described what you encountered as the top diplomat on the ground in Ukraine as a, and I quote, highly irregular, informal channel of U.S. policymaking. You testified that the channel included Ambassador Volker, Sondland, Secretary Perry, and as you later learned, the president's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Both of you have explained that you grew seriously concerned when you realized that the interests of this irregular channel diverged from official U.S. policy and interests. Was Mr. Giuliani promoting U.S. national interests or policy in Ukraine, Ambassador?
I don't think so, ma'am.
Mr. Kent?
No, he was not.
What interests do you believe he was promoting, Mr. Kent?
I believe he was looking to dig up political dirt against a potential rival in the next election cycle.
Ambassador Taylor? What interests do you believe he was promoting?
I agree with Mr. Kent.
The State Department's role is to promote U.S. policies overseas, not to help the current president win re-election. Is that correct, Mr. Kent?
All federal government employees are subject to the Hatch Act, and our actions are supposed to be promoting policy and not involved in partisan politics.
Ambassador Taylor?
I agree.
What is the risk of running a separate channel of diplomacy that is completely outside of normal channels and does not further U.S. policy goals, Ambassador Taylor?
Ms. Evans, it's possible to do one, but not the other. That is, if it's completely against U.S. policy goals, then that's a mistake. Then it's not helpful. You can get advice and even have conversations outside of the normal channels, but then they need to be part of U.S. foreign policy and approaching those goals.
Mr. Kent?
Agree.
Ambassador Taylor, you have described in your previous testimony one instance shortly after you arrived in Ukraine in which Ambassador Sondland asked State Department officials not to listen to a July 28th call he had planned to hold with President Zelensky. Did you find that unusual?
I did.
What was the impact of Ambassador Sondland making that request? And you found it unusual. What do you believe the impact was?
Ms. Evans, I'm not sure there was an immediate impact.
Was there a recording or transcription?
There was not. That was the impact. It was not recorded.
Do you think that's why the request was made, so there would not be normal State Department employees from the Operations Center would have been there transcribing and taking notes?
That is the norm, but it is also it is not unusual to not have it recorded.
So you know that the State Department is holding your notes and refuses to provide them to Congress despite a duly authorized subpoena. And we know that in some instances, your notes may be the only documentary record of what happened. You are aware of that,
yes,
correct? And Mr. Kent, you are aware that your notes have not been turned over to Congress.
I have turned all records that I had in my possession to the State Department because whatever we do is considered a federal record, not a personal record.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, I have unanimous consent request.
Gentleman will state his request.
I have a New York Times op-ed stating why President Obama should have done more in investing in Ukraine by a trio of ambassadors, which includes William Taylor.
Without objection, that will be admitted into the record. Mr. Krishnamurthy.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. I'd like to walk you through a couple points raised by my colleagues on the other side. One is they claim that the July 25th call summary shows no evidence of pressure on the Ukrainian government. In fact, they argue the Ukrainians did not feel any pressure at any time to comply with any of President Trump's requests for investigations. In fact, Ambassador Taylor, at your deposition in October, you stated that due to the hold that President Trump placed on aid to the Ukrainians became, quote unquote, desperate. Isn't that right?
In August, they did not know, as far as I'm aware, but at the end of August, the article came out. In September, the Minister of Defense, for example, came to me, I would use the word desperate, to figure out why the assistance was being held. he thought that perhaps if he went to Washington to talk to you, to talk to the Secretary of Defense, to talk to the President, he would be able to find out and reassure, provide whatever answer was necessary to have that assistance released.
In fact, my colleagues on the other side suggest that President Zelensky personally did not feel any pressure at any time. And yet, later on in September, he finally relented in a conversation with Gordon Sondland, according to your deposition, in which he agreed to make a statement on CNN. Isn't that right?
He had planned to make a statement on CNN, yes, sir.
My colleagues also say that the hold on U.S. security assistance was lifted on September 11th without any investigations happening on the part of the Ukrainians, and therefore everything ended up fine in the end. However, Mr. Kent, as you know, the House Intelligence, Foreign Affairs, and Oversight Committees began this current investigation leading to the proceedings today on September 9th. In fact, it was only 2 days after this particular set of committees began their investigations that the Trump administration eventually released the military aid, correct?
That is a timeline, yes.
Mr. Ambassador Taylor, between the time of your October deposition and now, did anyone from the Trump administration contact you about your appearance before the committee today?
No, sir.
How about you, Mr. Kent?
No, sir.
Ambassador Taylor, I would like to turn to a word that by my count you used 13 times in your opening statement, and that word is concern. You were concerned that aid was being conditioned on political investigations, isn't that right?
Yes, sir.
You were concerned that irregular channels of diplomacy were being used in our foreign policy in the Ukraine, right?
Yes, sir.
Ambassador Taylor, can you rule out the possibility that these irregular channels of diplomacy are being used in other countries where we conduct foreign policy?
I can't, I've not heard of any other separate channel that has this kind of influence. That is the Giuliani kind of guidance.
But you can't rule it out, right?
No, sir.
And how about you, Mr. Kent? You can't rule it out either, right?
I have no basis to make a determination.
You don't believe the July 25th call was perfect, did you? Do you?
I think some of the language in the call gave cause for concern.
Ambassador Taylor?
I agree.
And what was the cause for concern for you?
There was part of the discussion of the previous ambassador was a cause for concern.
Ambassador Taylor, I want to draw on your experience finally as a West Point cadet and as an infantry commander in Vietnam. In a battlefield situation, is a commanding officer allowed to hold up action, placing his troops at risk until someone provides him a personal benefit?
No, sir.
Is that because if commanding officers did that, they would be betraying their responsibility to the nation and the men and women under their command?
Yes, sir.
And if that happened and were found out, could that person be subject to discipline?
Yes, sir.
Could that type of conduct trigger a court-martial?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman.
Mr. Chairman, let's have unanimous.
What purpose does the gentleman seek?
I thank the chairman. I have unanimous consent, ask unanimous consent to enter into the record Mr. Mulvaney's statement where he said there's absolutely no quid pro quo from October 17th, 2019.
Without objection. Mr. Nunes, you're recognized for any closing comments you'd like to make.
Mr. Chairman.
I've recognized Mr. Nunes for his comments. Ms. Conaway, we will get your motion.
Okay.
After Mr. Nunes' brief closing remarks and my brief closing remarks, it's my intention to excuse the witnesses. We'll have a very brief recess. Members should not go far. We will resume and take up Mr. Conaway's motion. Mr. Nunes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll just be brief. I want to reiterate what I said earlier, and that is that we really should stop holding these hearings until we get the answer to three important topics. The first being the full extent of the Democrats' prior coordination with the whistleblower and who did the whistleblower coordinate with. Second, the full extent of Ukraine's election meddling against the Trump campaign. And third, why did Burisma hire Hunter Biden and what did he do for them? And did his position affect any government actions, U.S. government actions under the Obama administration? You are not allowing those witnesses to appear before the committee, which I think is a problem. So we'll expect, hopefully, you will allow us to bring the whistleblower, the folks that he spoke to, and also numerous Democratic operatives who worked with Ukraine to meddle in the election. And that I'll yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I want to thank the witnesses for their testimony today, for your decades of service to the country. I think you exemplify so many courageous men and women who serve in the diplomatic corps, who served in our military, who represent the United States so well around the world. I appreciate how you endeavored to stay out of the fray, to relate what you heard, what you saw, without additional commentary. That is as it should be. You were both compelled to appear, and we are grateful that you answered the lawful subpoenas that you received. The story that you have shared with us today and your experiences, I think, is a very deeply troubling one. It is the story of a dedicated ambassador, someone who served with great distinction, Ambassador Yovanovitch, who was the subject of a vicious smear campaign at the beginning of the year. It is the story of once this ambassador was pushed out of the way, the creation of a irregular channel, which Ambassador Taylor, you described, went all the way from the president through Mick Mulvaney, through Ambassador Sondland, through Ambassador Volker, to Rudy Giuliani. That over time became apparent was not serving the U.S. interest, but running deeply contrary to the U.S. interest, was in fact conditioning a White House meeting that the President of Ukraine desperately sought to establish himself as the new President of Ukraine and to demonstrate to friend and foe alike that he had a relationship with his most powerful patron, the United States of America, and conditioned $400 million of bipartisan taxpayer-funded military support for a nation at war on the front lines of Russian expansionism. A suspension of which was not in the U.S. interest, not in Ukraine's interest, not in our national security interest in no way, shape, or form. You've described a situation in which those in the service of the president made it clear to the Ukrainians they need to publicly announce these investigations or they weren't going to get that meeting and they sure weren't going to get that military assistance. Now, I would point out, and this may not have come to your attention, but it certainly came to our attention. On September 9th, Inspector General informed our committee that the Director of National Intelligence was withholding a whistleblower complaint in violation of the statute. By that point, on September 9th, that complaint had made its way to the White House. On September 9th, when the Inspector General informed Congress that that complaint had been withheld, the White House also learned that Congress now inevitably would learn about the complaint. It was less than 48 hours later that the military aid would be released. Over the weeks to come, or over the days to come, rather, we will hear from other dedicated public servants about other aspects of this effort to invite foreign interference in our election, to condition a White House meeting and military aid for the performance of political favors for the president's reelection campaign. We will hear from other witnesses. I appreciate members on both sides of the aisle who I think participated today in a serious way and in a civil way. This is as it should be. There is no shortage of strong feelings about what this means to the country. At the end of the day, we're going to have to decide, based on the evidence that you and others provide, whether we're prepared to accept in the presence of the United States a situation where the president for their own personal or political benefit can condition military aid, diplomatic meetings, or any other performance of an official act in order to get help in their reelection. Whether we will need to accept in this president or any future president the idea that the President of the United States can invite a foreign country to intervene in our affairs. These are the decisions we will have to make when we have to decide whether this president should be impeached. But I want to thank you again. Just conclude by saying, because I can't let it go unanswered, several of my colleagues made the statement repeatedly that I've met with the whistleblower, that I know who the whistleblower is. It was false the first time they said it. It was false the second through 40th time they said it. It will be false the last time they say it. With that, this concludes this portion of the hearing. I want to thank you, gentlemen. I ask everyone to remain in their seats. The witnesses are excused. Please allow them to leave the committee room. We will, once they leave the committee room, take a brief recess, and then we will resume to take up Mr. Conaway's motion. And once again, I thank you, gentlemen. The committee is in a brief recess subject to the call of the chair. When we resume shortly, we'll take up Mr. Conaway's motion.